Accordingly, in 1640, that ecclesiastical constitution was ratified by Act of Parliament, an act which, in express terms, recognizes General Assemblies rightly constitute as the proper and competent judge in all matters ecclesiastical. And here a footnote, Act 4, Parliament 2nd, Chapter 1. Besides, the Parliament of 1640 passed an act abolishing prelacy, civilly, and annulling all and whatsoever acts of Parliament, laws, and constitutions, insofar as they derogate and are prejudicial to the spiritual nature, jurisdiction, discipline, and privileges of this kirk, or general, provincial, presbyterial assemblies, and kirk sessions, and which act in so many words declares that the sole and only power and jurisdiction within this kirk stands in the kirk of God, as it is now reformed. And here a footnote, Act 6, Parliament 2, Chapter 1. The presentations which belonged to the bishops fell into the hands of presbyteries, which could provide a minister with the consent of the parish, and upon the suit and calling of the congregation, without any presentation at all. Here a footnote, Act 8, Parliament 2, Chapter 1, Cunningham's defense of the rights of the Christian people. His Majesty was present in person at the Parliament of 1641, and gave his royal assent and sanction to all these and other acts in favor of the Church of the Second Reformation. To redress, in part, the grievances of patronage, he was prevailed upon to present one from a leet of 6, furnished by the presbytery, with consent of the majority of the congregation. In 1643, application was made for the restriction of the leet to 3 in the lowlands and 1 in the highlands, on account of the difficulty of obtaining 6 qualified persons. Then at least the question of lay patronage began to be agitated, and in 1649, through the influence of the Church, the obnoxious statute was got entirely repealed. At and before which time, says the Act of Restoration under Charles II, the patronages were most injuriously dispossessed of their patronages. Lay patronage, or a civil right in the appointment of spiritual officers, is intrinsic of the Church and incompatible with her intrinsic authority, and is extrinsic of the Church and incompatible with her intrinsic authority and spiritual independence. Then, however, the power of appointment was brought entirely within the Church from first to last. She was left to frame her own regulations, and whatever may be thought of her propriety, they were her own, at least, and not imposed from without. And they possessed this recommendation, that they recognized no property qualification upon the part of persons nominating more than consenting. In 1645, the Assembly adopted the Directory for Worship, the first fruit of the labors of the Westminster Assembly of Divines, then sitting in London, and applied to Parliament to give validity to their act civilly, which they confirmed. They were relatively free to give or withhold civil effect. Still, this did not preclude the Church from giving it effect ecclesiastically. The Assembly likewise approved of the propositions respecting church government and ordination of ministers under their own explanations, reserving the right of further discussion respecting the distinct rights and interests of presbyteries and people in the calling of ministers. In those times, the absence of a royal commissioner did by no means assist the procedure of the Assembly, as little was his presence deemed necessary to its validity. There seems to have been none sent to that of 1640, nor any from 1643 to 1649. His Majesty, in his letter to the Assembly of 1646, alleges that he could not conveniently send one, but promises to use his endeavor to maintain the religion of the country, as it is established in doctrine, worship, and church government. In things strictly ecclesiastical, the Church acted separately, and upon her own intrinsic authority, and in things of a twofold character, like soul and body, or partly civil and partly ecclesiastical, she acted more in concert with the state, as in the case of the mutual adoption of the national covenants, those national securities for the civil and religious liberties of the country. She was vigilant and ever jealous of anything in the form of Erastian supremacy. When the English Parliament was resolved to reserve to itself an appellate jurisdiction over the censures of the new Presbyterian establishment in the South, the Scottish Assembly and Parliament promptly remonstrated, and insisted that the jurisdiction of the Church ought to be final. Here a footnote. That from Neil's History of the Puritans. When the Confession of Faith came down from the Westminster Assembly, it was carefully read, examined, and considered. And though it contained an express assertion of Christ's sole headship over his church, of her distinct government and jurisdiction in the hands of church officers, and of their right to exercise the keys of the church, and of the power of spiritual courts ministerially to determine controversies of faith, and though it declared that the magistrate may not assume to himself the administration of word and sacrament, or the power of the keys of the kingdom, yet it was not adopted without certain limitations, and here a footnote. Act of Assembly prefixed to the Confession. In the Act of Approbation, the intrinsic power of the Church to convene her own assemblies in her ordinary and settled state was distinctly asserted. So zealous was the Assembly against Erastianism that ministers were censurable for silence respecting it, and recommended to study the controversy that they might more effectually confute the gainsayer. In the renovation of the Solemn League it was expressly condemned, while the parties pledged themselves to defend the Church against all who might attempt to supplant her liberties. That deed itself was virtually directed against regal supremacy, as the National Covenant had been directed against papal. The one kept down an earthly ecclesiastical head within the Church, and the other brought down a civil. The National Church in these times honored the true head, and preeminently honored her by his presence and spirit, and rendered her a singularly efficient and useful institution. And here a footnote, Kirkton's Secret and True History of the Church of Scotland. In 1648, after careful examination, the catechisms, larger and shorter, were adopted by the Assembly as subordinate standards, and application was made to the Parliament of 1649 for legal securities in the peaceable possession of them. After due consideration, the Confession and Catechisms, with the Assembly's acts of adoption, were ratified, and the legal securities granted, and thus civil effect was given to the Church's ecclesiastical constitutions. Upon the accession of Charles II, the Scottish Parliament ordained that before he was admitted to the exercise of royal power, he should swear to preserve the established religion as then professed, and that he should agree that all matters civil be determined by the parliaments of this kingdom, and all ecclesiastical matters by the General Assembly of this kirk. Here a footnote. Act 15, the 7th of February, 1649. They restricted and suspended their allegiance as they had practically done towards his father from 1643, until he should give the necessary securities for the religion and liberties of the kingdom. These he gave, sware, and subscribed the national covenants, mounted the throne of Scotland upon specific conditions, and yet, appalling to relate, little sooner was he restored to power after the interregnum of the Protectorate, that he rescinded all the securities for the established religion of Scotland, abolished presbytery, restored prelacy, patronage, and the supremacy, and brought the head of the pious and patriotic Argyle to the block, the very nobleman who had set the crown upon his own head. A blacker case of perfidy, profligacy, and perjury perhaps the sun himself never shone upon. Here a footnote. That from Shield's Hind Let Loose. A long, dark, and stormy winter of 28 years persecution commenced. Those who suffered during that period were eminently confessors and martyrs for the crown of Christ. Their invincible attachment to his royal prerogatives and uncompromising opposition to Caesar's usurpations exposed them to awful and appalling calamities. Conformity to prelacy and submission to that sacrilegious supremacy which introduced it were enforced by fines and forfeitures, tests and oaths, bonds and imprisonments, torture and banishment, and death itself. Upwards of a third part of the ministers were ejected because they had been admitted subsequent to the abolition of patronage, and could not in conscience accept a presentation from a patron, coalition from a bishop, and subscribe the qualifying oaths. And here a footnote. Kirkton, Brown's apologetical relation as quoted in Cunningham's defense. Many of them refused to lay down their commissions at the command of an Erastian head, and began to exercise it in private houses, and subsequently in the fields. This became a capital offense, nay, even to hear the gospel preached by their outed pastor. Many of the people, rather than abandon the pastor of their choice, or be driven by soldiers to hear the worthless and soul-starving hirelings of the supremacy, hazarded their lives, and took cheerfully the spoiling of their goods. The ejected ministers were severely tried by ensnaring indulgences, which sprang immediately from man's supremacy, And alas, many of them were tempted either to compromise or betray their Lord. And here a footnote. See Brown's History of the Indulgence.